Hi, I'm Emily Crookston, a visiting assistant professor at Coastal Carolina University. I specialize in political philosophy, ethics, and the history of early modern philosophy. Today I'll be commenting on Bradley Beall's paper, Crime and Punishment, Is Hard Incompatibilism Impractical? First, before I start my comments, I just want to thank the Jackson Family Center for Ethics and Values, and especially David Kaloran for organizing this online conference. I think it's a great idea, and I'm really looking forward to listening to the other videos and hearing what people think. And I also want to give thanks to Bradley Beall for presenting us with such a stimulating and engaging paper to discuss today. Here's the structure of my talk, and you can follow along with the handout that's posted along with this video. First of all, I'm just going to summarize the paper, tell you how I'm reading Beall, so we're all on the same page, and then I'll give some comments. Okay, so the summary. So Beall basically wants to defend hard incompatibilism against what he takes to be a strong objection to the view. Now, as he tells us, hard incompatibilism is the view that whether determinism or indeterminism turn out to be true, both are inconsistent with the notion of human free will. So free will is necessary for human beings to be morally responsible. What that means is, as Beall tells us, no one is ever morally responsible for her actions. Now, what's the objection that Beall wants to respond to? Basically, the worry is, look, hard incompatibilism is impractical, or at least it has impractical implications when we consider it as a challenge to our justice system. Now, what's motivating this objection? Well, here's the problem. We currently treat our criminals as if they are, in fact, morally responsible. So basically, our justice system is based on a retributivist theory of punishment that says the main purpose of incarceration is to make the criminal pay for a bad action for which he or she is responsible and thus deserving of punishment. So retributivism basically says, look, the punishment should fit the crime. Now, Beall, as a defender of hard incompatibilism, says, so much the worse for retributivism, right? If there's no moral responsibility, then you can't deserve punishment, right? We need a new theory of punishment. Saul Smilansky, the objector and a critic of hard incompatibilism, says, this is all well and good, but look, if we reject retributivism, then we can't justify the incarceration of criminals unless we can also compensate them for their loss of freedom or the harm being done to them by locking them up. So I've formalized the objection. I call it the punishment objection on page 1 of the handout. So if you want to look at that and follow along, here's how I understand Smilansky's objection. If hard incompatibilism is true, then criminals, along with other human beings, are not morally responsible, the basic statement of hard incompatibilism. If hard incompatibilism is true, then criminals who are incarcerated are unjustly harmed. Hard incompatibilism is true. The only way to erase such injustice is to compensate criminals by providing them with lavish living arrangements. And this is the heart of the punishment objection, right? So Smilansky thinks if we're going to compensate them, we have to do it in a particular way by giving them these lavish living arrangements. But this is obviously impractical. Now, all true ethical views must be practical. Therefore, hard incompatibilism must be false. So Smilansky is saying that the theory of punishment recommended by hard incompatibilism doesn't really fare any better than retributivism itself. So hard incompatibilism is true, but we don't get a better theory of punishment. It's impractical. Now here's Beall's thesis. So he wants to say instead of punishment, the hard incompatibilist should accept an alternative way to compensate criminals. He calls this a quarantine treatment model, which he borrows from Dirk Pereboom. So here's Beall's response to the objection, right? The quarantine treatment model shows that hard incompatibilism can allow for practical treatment of criminals. So we get this new theory of punishment. So instead of retributivism or instead of punishment, we get this quarantine-based rehabilitation theory of punishment that Beall's advocating, where the main purpose of incarceration is to make the criminal better. And this rehabilitation, this making the criminal better, is adequate compensation for the loss of freedom. But at the same time, we're also protecting society from harm by getting that criminal off the street. So Beall is basically saying, look, we should treat criminals in the way we treat victims of disease who need to be quarantined. Right? We don't blame people for coming down with this disease, but we do say to them, look, we need to get you out of society so that your disease doesn't get spread to others, so that there's no more harm to society in general. So we get this nice solution to the worry that was raised, right? We get a justification for incarceration without assuming moral responsibility. We can say we're incarcerating these criminals, but we're not necessarily blaming them. We're getting rid of the language of moral blame. So that's the basic summary of Beall's paper. So now for my comments. First of all, I want to say this is a really interesting topic. I like to hear philosophers considering and defending the practical implications of their metaphysical views, so I think it's a really great topic to be taken up. I also think that Beall's on the right track in contrast to the punishment kind of solution to this issue, this problem that Smolansky raises, right? So both Smolansky and Beall agree that if hard incompatibilism turns out to be true, we need a radical revision of our justice system. And I like that Beall seems to be taking a scalpel rather than a butcher knife to the justice system. So I think for those reasons, the quarantine treatment model seems more practical than punishment, at least insofar as I understand it. It's not going to require some kind of lavish living arrangements for criminals. It's simply going to require some additional focus on making criminals better, right? Helping them to become better people. Right? So I like that aspect of it. And I think the quarantine treatment model requires us to think about the causes of criminal behavior and how to fix those problems in a way that punishment does not require us to do that, right? So it's the basic idea is, look, rehabilitation versus removal, right? It seems like Beall is advocating for helping criminals to get out of the situation that they're in some ways, make them better people, make them successful contributors to society, whereas all punishment does is just remove them from society. It still just locks them up in a closet, even though it's a really luxurious closet. It doesn't focus at all on fixing the criminal or making the criminal better. It only focuses on helping society or avoiding harm in society. So for those reasons, I really like what Beall's trying to do here. Now here are some questions in some places where I really want to push Beall a little further. First of all, I think there's two questions that really need to be teased apart here, and I think they get blended together and confused in some ways in the paper. First of all, is hard incompatibilism true? I take that to be a question about metaphysics, a question about whether moral responsibility exists, whether freedom of the will exists, right? So that's the first question. Is hard incompatibilism true? And the second one is hard incompatibilism practical? I think insofar as insofar as Beall's interpretation of Smolansky's objection is true, really Smolansky's arguing for raising the second question, right? Is this practical? But I don't think that has any bearing on the metaphysical truth of hard incompatibilism. And so in that sense, I'm not sure the objection is in fact logical the way that Beall sets it up, or possibly the way Smolansky sets it up. But even if it's correct, right, even if this interpretation is correct, it doesn't seem to be a very good objection to hard incompatibilism. Right, so if Smolansky is asking the second question about whether hard incompatibilism is practical and saying that it's not, he seems to be rejecting the idea of getting rid of the concept of moral responsibility. Right, so insofar as hard incompatibilism is a true metaphysical theory, we might think it could be compatible with a number of different theories of punishment. Smolansky's picked out one, Beall's picked out another one, but neither of these, any of this debate has anything to do with the truth of hard incompatibilism. So if we look again at this objection, right, even if we buy premises 4 and 5, right? Even if we do think that punishment is the best way to compensate criminals and that it's obviously impractical, that doesn't make hard incompatibilism necessarily false. And even if we buy premise number 6, which says that all true ethical views have to be practical, hard incompatibilism isn't an ethical view, or isn't a moral theory, it's a metaphysical one. So I don't think the objection really works as Beall has set it up. So then I worry about why he takes himself to be responding to it, or needing to respond to it in the first place. My third comment for Beall is a question. What does Beall mean by the quarantine-based rehabilitation? What exactly does he mean by this idea? How is he applying the idea of quarantine-based rehabilitation to the justice system? So I take it that Beall thinks we should stop using the language of retributivism and blame and desert, right? We should trade in that kind of language for maybe strength-based language, some kind of language that would be more helpful. Rather than calling the individual bad, we say, here's what a good action would look like, right? Some kind of shift in the language that we use when we're discussing crime and talking to criminals. And I think what we usually mean by rehabilitation for criminals is doing something to make criminals positive contributors to society, right? So we would incarcerate them in basically the same way we do now, but in addition we would give them therapy, we would teach them how to manage their anger in certain ways. Maybe we would educate them and teach them trades so that they have options rather than committing crimes. When they leave prison, they can get good jobs. Something like that, right? Some focus on making criminals positive contributors to society in some ways. So that's the basic idea behind rehabilitation, quarantine-based rehabilitation. I'm curious about how Beall is seeing this as compensation for criminals. Okay, so he seems to accept that criminals should be compensated if hard incompatibilism is true and criminals aren't responsible for their activities, for their behaviors. We do need to compensate them for that loss of freedom when we take them out of society. But how is rehabilitation really compensation? So we think of it as analogous to quarantine for diseases. What is the compensation that those victims receive? Well, maybe it's free medical care. Maybe these folks wouldn't be able to take care of themselves, but when we quarantine them, they get the best medical treatment available. Also, maybe we think quarantined victims should be paid lost wages for having to miss work, things like that, right? Those would be measures of compensation that we could give to those victims. So my worry when it comes to Beall's view is, whereas I can see punishment as being genuine compensation, the quarantine rehabilitation model doesn't immediately seem to me to be compensating criminals for anything. So we might think of this therapy or the education that I suggested before as sort of being a way to bring criminals up to, I don't know, the norm of society, right? Maybe we want to suggest that criminals are often disadvantaged somehow in society. So they're actually below the normal population when it comes to education, say. And now, once they're in prison, we're going to give them this education that they were lacking. But if the idea of compensation is to, sort of pay them back for the loss of freedom or the loss of their rights, then it doesn't look like giving them that education really compensates them for that. It just seems like it brings them up to some kind of level balance with others in society who had the advantages of their upbringing or something along those lines. So the basic idea is that Beall seems to think the criminals should be compensated, but I wonder how he's thinking of rehabilitation as playing this compensating role for criminals. And then my last comment. How would Beall propose to compensate criminals who cannot be cured? Okay, so it seems like certain criminals can't be rehabilitated. There's no possibility of rehabilitation in some cases. So, for example, we might think of pedophiles or psychopaths, right? You might think there's no way to make these folks positive contributors to society. That's just not a possibility for some of these folks. So it seems that Beall would suggest that these criminals who can't be cured in some sense, can't be rehabilitated, should be incarcerated for life. Okay, but if rehabilitation is really the only means available for compensating criminals, as Beall seems to be suggesting, I wonder what he thinks, how he thinks we're going to compensate those folks who cannot be rehabilitated. So perhaps he would say that punishment here actually is an adequate solution for incurable criminals, right? Insofar as they can't be rehabilitated, insofar as they cannot be compensated in that way, we need to compensate them differently. And so maybe he would say for those rare individuals who are incapable of being fixed, being cured in this sense, those folks really would deserve this kind of lavish living arrangement that Smolansky seems to be suggesting. So I'm just not sure how we're supposed to think of compensating criminals who can't be rehabilitated on Beall's view. So that's the basic, those are the basic comments I have for Beall, and I really look forward to hearing what others have to say about this very interesting topic. Thank you.